We're exploring some size options for the Miami Dolphins at wide receiver on today's episode of Locked On Dolphins. Three big-bodied pass catchers from the 2024 NFL Draft. How would they fit the Dolphins' offense versus where are they projected to be drafted here today on Locked On Dolphins?
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Cal Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. And sometimes, like today, twice a day. Doubleheader here today on Locked On Dolphins on Thursday, March 28th, 2024. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Exploring the age-old question here on the show, does size matter? Maybe not in the way you're used to having the question be heard asked, but nevertheless, the Dolphins have two bona fide star wide receivers in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, but they seemed to be looking for some stature in the wide receiver room, whether it was Eric Ezukama, who they drafted as a bit of a surprise with a mid-round pick, seemed primed to have a nice customized role within the Dolphins offense, and then trading for Chase Claypool when Eric Ezukama goes down for the season, and Cedric Wilson stepping into a prominent role. The team talking about the evolution or alluding to the broadcast teams later in the season about the evolution of the offense needing some evolution from the tight end position. Stature, a little bit of a different pitch than what Miami has had. And when you consider how Kansas City late in the season was able to really dictate at the line of scrimmage terms to the Dolphins wide receivers, having somebody you could put on the line of scrimmage and feel like you had the confidence that they would defeat press coverage certainly would go a long way in combating one of the things that really disrupted the timing of the Dolphins offense late in the season. Three wide receivers we're going to look at here today on the show. Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU, Xavier Legette from South Carolina, and Keon Coleman from Florida State. If you wanted the marquee size receiver in this year's class, it would be Marvin Harrison Jr. at 6'3", who's allegedly been tracked on GPS timing on the field with the ball in his hands over 22 miles per hour. Special talent. Not going to be there for the Dolphins. Probably not going to make it outside the top 5. So I did a assessment of Marvin Harrison Jr. I'm not going to dedicate the airtime to Marvin Harrison Jr. Because that feels like teasing everybody, including myself, talking about how he would fit with Miami's offense, given the Dolphins are not going to be in striking distance to land the services of Marvin Harrison Jr. one way or another. So instead, we shift our focus to, let's start with Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU. Brian Thomas Jr. Was a junior declarant, or I guess technically based off the junior declarant into the 2024 NFL Draft. Big breakout season this past season, 68 receptions for 1,177 yards, and 17 touchdowns, averaging 17.3 yards per catch in his role, helping the LSU Tigers bring a Heisman Trophy back to Baton Rouge, courtesy, of course, of quarterback Jaden Daniels and his ascension into being a presumed top 5 pick himself. Thomas came to the NFL Combine and weighed in at 209 pounds at 6'3". Very impressive wingspan, 90th percentile wingspan, 79 and 5/8 inches. Amongst all NFL wide receivers to come through the NFL Combine since like 2000. And then he ran a 4.33 and jumped 38.5 inches in the vertical jump with a 1.5 second 10-yard split. That's what the book is on this football player. 77th percentile in height, 67th percentile in weight, 89th percentile in wingspan, 94th percentile 40-yard dash, 88th percentile 10-yard split, 82nd percentile vertical jump. Height, weight, speed. This is the definition of that kind of football player. As a result, Brian Thomas is often mocked in the top 20 or the top 25 and almost in everyone's first round mock drafts because he has all the things you can't coach an NFL wide receiver. I do have some questions about his style of play. I wish a player of that stature brought more physicality in the ancillary components of playing the position. You're not drafting Brian Thomas to block, but this is an offense, particularly that I'm evaluating, and blocking skills get evaluated. No block, no rock. Right? We've said it many times. It's Chase Claypool couldn't get on the field consistently when he first came to Miami because he couldn't hit a block to save his life. And I wished a player with this kind of stature had a more impressive resume this season away from the football. And then I also have some questions about the routes that Brian Thomas runs, the versatility of the route tree that he has, and the incubation period for him to become a more diverse player that can contribute in more ways than just a handful in the Dolphins offense. I would hate for Miami to take a marquee investment opportunity and bring in a player that can really only do a handful of things. And that's what I'm worried about with Brian Thomas. Now, he's got excellent ball tracking skills down the field. He's got outstanding length. His catch radius is supreme. You know who he reminds me of? Devontae Parker. Now, if you want to go back to square one with Devontae Parker before Devontae Parker became the woe is me hamstring issue player Devontae Parker and try it again, the comparables between the two is pretty startling as far as like the stature, the weight. Brian Thomas runs about 1/10 of a second faster in the 40-yard dash than Devontae Parker did. But they're both similarly explosive players. I think they're both similar in how they stack vertically down the field. I think they're both similar in how they win at the catch point, but sometimes frustratingly don't consistently win at the catch point. Well, you'll see Brian Thomas go up against, I believe, Texas A&M on a sideline go route, and he will use the full length of his wingspan, and he will open himself back up to the quarterback and the ball, and he will high point it with his hands with an excellent reception. And then there's other times where he gets a deep post shot and he tries to run underneath a ball that he's closely contested with and allows the defender to play around his frame because he tries to catch the ball low instead of understanding a ball that's marginally underthrown. I need to high point this football to protect the ball the way that you would expect like a power forward or so to box out in basketball. So Thomas ran plenty from the slot. And I think that's a notable thing for Miami and their offense, particularly with the weaponry of Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill and having guys that can line up outside, but can also line up in the slot and having some versatility. But it was the production from the slot that really opens your eyes with Brian Thomas Jr. The overwhelming majority of his production as a receiver this year in the LSU offense came from the slot on fade routes. He ran fades, he ran hitches, and a lot of his hitches were free access playing off of Malik Neighbors, who we're also not going to spend a lot of time talking about on this program because that's Jalen Waddle incarnate. He is lightning in a bottle, as electric as they come. Just weighed in at the pro day for LSU at 199 pounds and ran in the low 4.3s, probably bulked to 199. I would bet runs in the 4.4 or 4.3s at his playing weight, and has electric tackle breaking ability and excellent leaping ability and excellent ball skills. And he himself is going to continue to come into his own as a route runner in the same way that Jalen Waddle has since he's come in the league. But both of those guys, Neighbors and Thomas, they really pop for their athleticism. Brian Thomas is not a quick twitch, like wiggle player, but he is loose for a player at 6'3". So there's This really fascinating blend. The question is just, I didn't see a lot of separation that didn't come on the vertical plane where he could really open up his strides and stack you vertically, especially from the slot where he has all that extra room to run into, unless he ran these kind of lazy hitches on the perimeter where teams are playing quarters or teams are playing cover 3 with bail technique and they're playing soft on the perimeter and it just turns into pitch and catch because there's a void. We'll talk about how I value him versus these other 2 wide receivers and the other wide receivers that we have talked about thus far on the show here at the end of today's program. But we're now going to shift gears for South Carolina's Xavier Legette, another big-bodied pass catcher eligible for the 2024 NFL Draft and a potential target for the Dolphins. Stick with us. Say goodbye to buying tickets with stress, courtesy of Gametime, the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. Gametime offers you views from your seats before you hit purchase on your tickets, and they also give you upfront pricing, so there's no surprises when you put tickets into your cart and then go to checkout. And surprise, you got tens and tens of or hundreds sometimes in processing fees and other fees and taxes on your tickets. Gametime is obsessed with finding you ways to save money on your tickets. They have deals right up to the start of your event, whether that's football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And even an hour after that event starts, it is the place to find last-minute seats. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. You can buy tickets on just a few taps from your phone. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, for $20 off. Download Gametime today on last-minute tickets. Lowest prices, guaranteed. If you thought the glow up for Brian Thomas this past season was real, and it was, he had 1,900 receiving yards and 24 touchdowns total, and 1,217 came this past season for LSU. Xavier Legette is an even more extreme incidence of this, and this is a fifth-year senior. He's been with the South Carolina program since 2019. And in 2019, he caught 9 passes for 80 yards. And in 2020, in 6 games, he caught 7 passes for 113 yards. And then in 2021, he caught 8 passes for 63 yards. And then in 2022, he caught 18 passes, nearly doubled his career total for 167 yards and 3 touchdowns, more than doubled his touchdowns. And then this season, 2023, he caught 71 balls for 1,255 yards and 7 touchdowns, averaging 17.7 yards per catch on the season at 6'1" and 225 pounds. Came in at the combine at 221. And he doesn't have Brian Thomas's 90th percentile wingspan, but he does have a 62nd percentile wingspan, in spite of being 6'1", which is 48th percentile for height. So he's not as tall. He's 2 inches shorter than Brian Thomas. His wingspan is shorter, but a more impressive proportion for being longer in the arms. And he's heavier by 12 pounds than Brian Thomas. And I would not be surprised if the playing weight of those two players was an even more stark difference. And it shows up on tape. And here's the thing about Xavier Legette. Xavier Legette, with the ball in his hands multiple times in the 2023 season, was tracked over 22 miles per hour in the open field with the ball in his hands. So this is another big pass catcher. This is another big-bodied player. But he also, like Brian Thomas, has a gear and explosiveness to him that makes him a fascinating component to get really down to the core principles of what the Dolphins want. They want speed. They want explosiveness. They want explosive plays. And Sharp Football, Warren Sharp, put out a statistic on March 24th at the beginning of this week. Very impressive numbers. He had 4 yards per route run against man coverage on the season. That is the highest figure of eligible wide receivers for the 2024 NFL Draft. And to put that into perspective, Tyreek Hill on the season averaged like 3.5 yards per route run in the NFL and was head and shoulders above everybody else. Xavier Legette had 4 yards per route run against man coverage in 2023. Killed man coverage. And that was what the Dolphins were all about. And that's the fascinating thing to me about Xavier Legette. For a late stage breakout player, I was not expecting this to be such a refined route runner in several areas. He works the line of scrimmage well. He works the top of the stem well. He's more fluid than I ever would have guessed for a 225-pound player. He's got excellent leaping ability. At the NFL Combine, he jumped 40 inches, which is 1.5 inches higher than what Brian Thomas did. And he shows it, whether it's adjustments along the sideline and then getting 2 feet down. I watched Xavier Legette's tape, and I came away higher than I thought that I ever would be for his film based on like his profile as a 1-year breakout player. And you saw some of the scheme touches that South Carolina gave him. And if you just watch the highlights, you'd say, okay, like vertical down the field player, scheme touch player, but late stage, what's the developmental curve going to look like? This is a totally different ballgame than that. So how did South Carolina use Legette? I think that's an important part of this conversation. This conversation thus far really illustrating the value within the South Carolina offense and kind of hinting at this not just being a 1-year wonder. And I know one of the comparisons that people are making in draft circles around Xavier Legette is Jonathan Mingo. And I don't think that comparison could be further off the mark as far as the style of play. You saw scheme touches for Xavier Legette. Yes, they ran him on jet sweeps. They ran him on perimeter screens. They got the ball quickly into his hands on design touches to try to get him out in space with his size and explosiveness. But then they put him in the slot. And he ran deep crossing routes. He ran hard-angled outbreaking routes and snapped off for separation. He ran on the perimeter against press coverage and had success working hard-angled routes that worked back down towards the sideline. Comebacks. I thought he had the best separation on comeback routes of anybody in this trio of wide receivers that we're talking about. So you saw kind of a diversity of ways in which he was used and a surprising level of route polish for a player who had not been able to put together any meaningful production before this season. And then you pair that and you go back to 4.0 yards per route run. And this Dolphins offense, through the middle of December last season, killed teams head and shoulders, the best team in the NFL against man coverage. And then Tyreek Hill got hurt. And then Jalen Waddle got hurt. And that element disappeared. And the entire conversation that we're having about a third option in the passing game is, what player can you find and add that if somebody overcommits the assets to the other players on the Dolphins offense, who can win a one-on-one? This is the guy who can do it. And it's not a conclusion that I was mentally prepared to come to, because I knew he had a flashy season. I knew he had the height, weight, speed, but you're always leery about the late year breakout guys. I did not see a traditional late year breakout, unsustainable style of creating production. Now we will shift gears and talk about Keon Coleman, a transfer to Florida State from Michigan State from this past season. Another big-bodied pass catcher. That's next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every single game of the 20. Whether you're betting on a big upset or you're betting on a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing with America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who is going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Keon Coleman is a challenging evaluation for me. And here's some transparency. Not every player you watch, you come away with the kind of conviction that you thought that you, or you hoped that you would. And sometimes that makes the player not for you. I don't believe Keon Coleman's going to be for me, but it doesn't really matter if he's quote unquote for me. It matters if he's for the Dolphins. I can see some ways in which Keon Coleman would be an appealing player for the Dolphins. He's 6'3" and a quarter, 213 pounds. He runs a 4.61, but very explosive in the jumps. He's on par with Brian Thomas and Xavier Legette in the vertical jump and the broad jump. 38 inches in the vertical jump, 10 feet, 7 inches in the broad jump at 213 pounds. That is a big-bodied wide receiver, and I do think he is, from a linear perspective, explosive. But you watch the tape, and he flashed big time at Michigan State, and you're like, wow, like Jayden Reed, you're watching Jayden Reed tape this time last year before the draft. You're like, wow, Coleman's kind of a stud. Where's he going to end up? And then he goes to Florida State, and the season starts strong. He scores 3 touchdowns in the season opener against LSU. Really impressive plays. It highlights what he does best. He's a big-bodied guy with very good ball skills and vertical tracking ability down the field. But he's the latest poster child for this GPS versus timed speed debate. And I think it brings some merit, but I think there's some context to it. So I wouldn't grade him too hardly on the 4.61 because that's timed speed. But when he's out on the field, his GPS timing at maximum speed is near the top of the class. And I know that was a big thing from the NFL Combine for him too. The issue the standoff I have with Coleman is I do think he's a little bit of a build-up speed player. He has an average 10-yard split. And I do think he's a long strider at 6'3". That's 83rd percentile for height for NFL wide receivers since 2000 in the NFL Combine. So a little bit of a long strider with a little bit of build-up speed practically. But then you get him out on the field when he's tracking the ball, and he's really capable of opening up those strides and really getting out on the hoof. He tracks the ball well vertically down the field, but from a timed speed perspective, his ability to stack you, or from a play speed perspective, his ability to stack you with consistency is not there. He had the biggest issue separating on the perimeter of any of the 3 players that we've talked about here today. And then you get these weird reps where they put him in the backfield against Florida and they run swing to him. And he's got a bunch of reps. I know Josh Norris from Underdog Fantasy just spotlighted this earlier today. I think he had more perimeter, like 4 times as many perimeter screens as any of the other major players in the class. And he's doing that at 6'3", 213 pounds. He returns punts. There's all these odd ways in which Florida State just tried to get the ball in his hands, but it didn't really click. It felt like they were forced touches for the sake of touches as compared to productive touches that put him in a position to do what he does successfully. And how he wins separation underneath, because he's a long strider, is he has to be physical with guys at the top of the stem. And I think he does that quite well, but there's instances where I think he gets called for push-offs at the NFL level at the top of the stem, well outside the contact window. Like really egregious against Clemson, extending to create 5 yards of separation on an out route. Because he's a long strider, if you're going to cut his route and he's working at the top of the stem, his ability to kind of work around you is kind of limited. And then he gets kind of stuck on you. And then there's this extra time, and he really has issue working across your face. But on the vertical plane stuff, he'll do a really good job working up to get up on top of your toes and then try to break out of it, but he doesn't have the same pop as the other guys. But then his time speed, or his GPS speed when the ball is in the air and it's time to hunt it down, and the ability to high point the football is probably as consistent as Xavier Legette's, and better than Brian Thomas to high point the football. And he's got better hands in my mind than Brian Thomas does at the contact window. So there's some give and some take. but he doesn't have the rare length from a wingspan perspective and the height, weight, speed element that Brian Thomas does. So he's a really conflicting player for me, for the Dolphins. I'll say this, though. He blocks his butt off, and I appreciate the heck out of that for Keon Coleman. You know, that offense did not at times put him in a lot of successful positions, whether they were getting the ball in his hands or not. But he's getting up on the perimeter on the backside of plays, and he's pushing hard off the line of scrimmage at the 10 yards, and he's getting his hands on corners, and he's moving them around. The analytics committee and analytics community hates Keon Coleman because Keon Coleman tests very poorly in every major yards versus zone, yards versus man, yards per route run, all that stuff. Some of that is usage. But there is a separation issue for Keon Coleman that I think exists in all phases, because I think he has to play overly physical to separate in the short stuff, which is where he's probably he's going to be masked with his stride to stack you vertically. But I think the best part of his game is the vertical elements of his game. It's just I don't think he has the initial gear in the first 10 yards to stack you quickly the same way the other guys do. So there's some darned if you do and darned if you don't with Keon Coleman. That's how I see him anyway. And then you put that within the Dolphins offense as a timing-based offense. If you're a third option and they're going to, really mug you and try to play physical, can he win at the line of scrimmage and play through contact? Yes, but some of the stickiness in trying to work through contact at the top of route stems is a little bit more concerning for me as far as a timing-based offense with spot throws where you got to get to your landmark with consistency. I just don't know how well it fits. He wouldn't be for me. So how do they stack up? To this point, the names that we've talked about, we had the big three, the guys that'll be long gone before Miami comes on the clock. I have those three: Harrison, Neighbors, and Odunze. If any of those are on the board for Miami when they pick, you run the card in, you don't think twice. If any of them fall to 15, you're probably getting on the phone trying to figure out, hey, can we make something happen? What do you need to get it done? Can we get a player swap in here involved? Can we get a 2025 pick swap involved to come up a few spots and get this guy? Like, they're that caliber of players. They'd be quality starters, in my opinion, from the jump on the Dolphins offense. Quality starters with ceiling to grow into being cornerstone players. Xavier Legette's the next guy for me. Out of all the options we've covered, we of course cover Brian Thomas, Xavier Legette, Keon Coleman today. We covered the Texas wide receivers and the Washington wide receivers yesterday. We covered, or we acknowledged the existence of Malik Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr. Pretty expansive list. Legette's the guy who I think has the most obvious crossover between his role and usage, affording the Dolphins something they don't already have, and a style of play that I think is sustainable within Miami's offense. Behind him, I would put Xavier Worthy for, again, the parallels to his role and usage. The speed element that he has that is an obvious fit for Miami. I just don't quite like him as much because it's a little bit too much more of the same versus a new dynamic in the room. Size does matter. A.D. Mitchell would be next on my list. And then Brian Thomas, Keon Coleman. And I would have both of those guys in front of the Washington duo of Jalen McMillan and Jalen Polk. A lot of names. We got a lot more to get to. We've already mentioned the Michigan wide receivers, Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson. I think Roman Wilson's a viable candidate for Miami in the second round if they go with a different direction. As far as where I would draft Xavier Legette, I think that's an important point. After getting out of the tape, I think there's a pretty good chance this ends up being a late first round, early second round pick. So I think this would have to be you strike out on offensive line, defensive line, marginal trade back, because again, then you get into Buffalo, you get into Detroit, you get into Baltimore, you get into Kansas City, There's a lot of landmines at the end. Does San Francisco have to trade Brandon Ayuk? If they do, they're at 31. Legette would make sense for all of those teams. So you don't get the warm and fuzzies about him being there at 55. I think that's a pipe dream. So depending on what happens with your trench play, maybe if you strike out, you can slide back a little bit, a few spots, and grab him. But don't expect him to be there at 55. I kind of have a hard time seeing him getting out of the first round. Thomas and Coleman, I think Thomas predictively will be wide receiver 4, just because of the height, weight, speed element. Teams are going to think we can teach him a more diverse route tree, and they'll probably be right. But I think the fit for Miami is not, I think, what it was sold as when he was a buzzy name for Miami in mock draft circles. I think there's a better chance that Xavier Legette is the tailor-made fit for this offense as a big-bodied, height, weight, speed, super explosive guy. And then Keon Coleman, I think he's probably on the conversation in day 2. I don't think he goes in the first round when it's all said and done as a challenging evaluation. But I would have a hard time envisioning him be the player that you would pick at 55 and say, yeah, this guy's going to come in and be a immediate, significant contributor to our team in 2024 and beyond, which I think is what we're aspiring for with these picks. That is going to do it for us on the Double Dip here today on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I hope you guys enjoyed the Double Dip. I hope you enjoyed the wide receiver conversation. We're going to come back tomorrow, maybe get into a different position group, spice things up a little bit. You're just going to have to come back and find out. I'm Kyle Krabs. Keep it locked in right here, Locked On Dolphins. Peace.